Well, in other news now, after days of bloodshed, Israel is removing the controversial metal detectors from the al-Aqsa mosque. The extra security provoked violent clashes over the past week. High-resolution cameras now that can spot hidden objects will be installed instead. Israeli forces installed the metal detectors at the entrances to the Noble Sanctuary compound after an attack left 2 Israeli policemen dead earlier this month. The move sparked protests from Palestinians who accused Israel of trying to extend control over Islam's third holiest site. Well, the 15-member United Nations Security Council is now meeting to discuss the crisis in Jerusalem. The meeting was requested by Sweden, France and Egypt. Let's get to the very latest now from our correspondent Liling Tan, live in New York. Liling, of course, this debate or this discussion, or rather this meeting within the UN Security Council comes at a very crucial time. How are members of the Security Council responding to this latest flare-up in Jerusalem?
Hey there, Lindy. A matter of clarification now. That urgent meeting called by Sweden and other nations that had occurred in the previous session. What occurred this session, this Tuesday at New York, UN's headquarters here in New York, was the quarterly debate on the longer-running Arab-Israeli conflict. However, the events in the past week around the al-Aqsa mosque, of course, was the primary focus during this debate. Now, the Council first heard from the UN's Middle East envoy, Nikolai Mladenov, who welcomed the removal of the metal detectors that you were just talking about, and he said that it hopes it will calm tensions. However, the removal of the metal detectors is far from diffusing the situation on the ground, as we saw prayer protests continuing outside the mosque as worshippers continued to, or rather as worshippers objected to the plans to put in place those smart cameras and instead calling for a return to the status quo before the latest eruption. Now, there is concern of further escalation, especially if the situation isn't resolved before the day of worship this Friday, the Muslim day of worship. And we heard from the US, Russia, France and the UK calls for restraint and de-escalation. China in particular said parties on the ground need to be fair, and he also called, and the Chinese ambassador to the UN, Liu Jie, also said the international community needs to work together to prevent the situation from escalating. The ambassador also reiterated China's proposals that, if you recall, were presented to Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas in Beijing during his visit last week, proposals that include a return to dialogue and advancing towards the two-state solution. Ambassador Liu also repeated that China is willing and ready to help as needed. Lindy?
Well, it is indeed encouraging to see the Security Council take this issue, take it up rather so quickly as a matter of urgency. But as you say, still risks of further escalation. I imagine the Security Council meeting itself on its own has not really resolved anything.
No, nor has it really resolved much where it comes to this crisis. Now, very often what happens at the Security Council during these debates on the Middle East peace process is it ends up serving as a microcosm of the bigger divisions that we're seeing play out on the ground in the Middle East. Much of those divisions, of course, between the direct parties themselves, Israel and Palestine. And we did hear more of the back and forth between both countries during this session. The Palestinian ambassador Riyad Mansour said events of the past week are a reminder of how easy it is to reach the precipice of a dangerous escalation. He said, although the crisis is not over, he hopes that there can be a return to relative calm, but he also took aim at Israel over actions that he said violated the historic status quo. And we also heard from the Israeli ambassador Danny Danon, who described to the Security Council the loss of lives over the past week and delivered a litany of accusations at the Palestinian Authority, saying they actively fund, promote and glorify terror. Now, also he took aim at the United Nations, suggesting that the UN was being manipulated by the Palestinians. So even though the Security Council did spotlight the latest flare-up in violence in Jerusalem, it's nowhere closer to resolve either the immediate, this flare-up situation, or even the longer-running Arab-Israeli conflict.
Indeed. Well, thank you so much for that update. Iling Tan, live for us there in New York.